Welcome everyone to History Gone Wilder, part of Half History Will Travel. I'm your host, the Wilder historian, Dr. Lucas Wilder, and we are moving right along with Sherman as he captures Atlanta. If you'd like to support the channel, consider subscribing if you haven't done so already, purchase something from the Teespring store or Etsy shop, or join the Patreon page. Every little bit helps. Thank you. After Kennesaw Mountain, Sherman kept up his flanking maneuvers to force Johnston to leave fortified areas. When Sherman crossed the Chattahoochee River, this forced Johnston to do the same to defend Atlanta. The Confederates were now entering the fortifications of the Georgia city in preparation for a stand. Because Sherman had outmaneuvered Johnston and Johnston hadn't put up much of a fight, Johnston was replaced by Corps Commander John Bell Hood. President Jefferson Davis appointed him to that position to be more aggressive, and Hood wouldn't disappoint the president. Sherman's men prepared fortifications to lay siege to Atlanta. On July 22nd, Hood launched an assault against James B. McPherson's Army of the Tennessee to the east of the city. It was a bloody fight, and the Confederate attack went somewhat as planned, but Union entrenchments stalled the attacks, and the Confederates were forced to fall back. However, there was one large Union casualty. Sherman's friend and commander of the Army of the Tennessee, James B. McPherson, was killed. When McPherson's body was brought in, Sherman wept over the body before sending it to have a full military funeral in Ohio. Sherman told an aide, "I expect something to happen to Grant and me. Either the rebels or the newspapers would kill us both, and I'll look to McPherson as the man to follow us and finish the war." The next difficult task was for Sherman to write to McPherson's fiancée in Baltimore about the man's death. He had written to her once before to explain why McPherson couldn't be allowed on furlough to marry her because the campaign was going to start and he needed what he called the rudder of the ship. This time he would also tell her bad news, but more devastating news. He wrote, "Better the bride of McPherson dead than the wife of the richest merchant of Baltimore." Emily, the bride-to-be, got little comfort from such a letter. She secluded herself in her room for a year, and she never married. Sherman wanted to name John A. Logan, the Illinois politician turned general, to command the Army of the Tennessee, but George Thomas, the commander of the Army of the Cumberland, protested. In the end, Sherman gave that position to Oliver Otis Howard. When Sherman informed Howard of his choice, Howard responded that Joseph Hooker, a corps commander and former commander of the Army of the Potomac, had seniority over himself. Sherman responded, "Hooker has not the moral qualities that I want, not those adequate to command. But if you don't want promotion, there are plenty who do." Howard took the position, and Hooker would resign in protest. The next step for Sherman was to cut the rail lines leading into Atlanta, so he moved Howard and his army to the Union right, but Hood would try to block the movement, and what resulted was the Battle of Ezra Church, another defeat for Hood. Confederate cavalry now plagued Sherman's supply trains, but carefully placed blockhouses, he believed, would protect the rail lines. Now was the time to put an end to the siege and destroy the last rail line leading to Atlanta. Sherman moved a force to Jonesboro below Atlanta, defeated the Confederate contingent there, then began dismantling the railroad. His men would take the rails, heat them in the middle, and twist them so that they could not be straightened out without machinery. They would become known as Sherman's bow ties or Mrs. Lincoln's hairpins. With the rail line gone, Hood didn't have any other option. He set fire to and exploded his magazines and such military goods as he could, then withdrew to meet up with the rest of his army. Sherman marched into the city on September 7th. There were no drums or bugles sounded to signal the defeat of the Confederacy. Sherman quietly rode with his staff to his new headquarters. When news reached the North about the successful campaign, newspapers lauded Sherman as a genius and brilliant. Sherman's brother in the Senate suggested a Grant-Sherman presidential ticket in the future. Prominent politicians and newspapers heaped praise on him for his actions in capturing Atlanta. Despite the praise, Sherman was concerned about one person's feelings the most, Thomas Ewing, his foster father and father-in-law. He wrote to Ewing soon after the capture of Atlanta. The letter read, "You have often said that Napoleon had no subordinate to whom he was willing to entrust 100,000 men, and yet I have lived to see the little red-headed urchin not only handle 100,000 men smoothly and easily, but fight them in masses of tens and 50,000s at a distance of hundreds of miles from his arsenals and sources of supplies. I feel in this less active pleasure than I know you do." In Atlanta, Sherman issued a controversial order, Special Field Orders No. 67, stating that Atlanta, being exclusively required to warlike purposes, will at once be vacated by all except the armies of the United States and such civilian employees as may be retained by the proper departments of the government. Uproar came from the city officials, who reminded Sherman of the women, children, and the elderly who inhabited the city. Sherman responded, "The use of Atlanta for warlike purposes is consistent with its character as a home for families. Sooner or later, want will compel the inhabitants to go. Why not go now, when all the arrangements are completed for the transfer, instead of waiting until the plunging shot of contending armies will renew the scenes of the past month? War is cruelty, and you cannot refine it." 705 adults, 860 children, and 79 slaves were evacuated. They were treated so fairly that a Confederate officer wrote Sherman a letter thanking him for his kindness. When Hood accused Sherman of unjust cruelty to civilians through the depopulation order, Sherman responded by reminding Hood that he himself burned dwelling houses because they stood in the way of your forts and men, and then told Hood that he and the Confederate leaders were responsible for bringing on the unnecessary war. The exchange of letters continued between the two army commanders, with Hood publishing them to stir up outrage. Support came from all over for Sherman's actions, particularly from the Lincoln administration. The War Department wrote, "Not only are you justified by the laws and usages of war in removing these people, but I think it is your duty to your own army to do so. We certainly are not required to treat the so-called non-combatants and rebels better than they themselves treat each other. Even here in Virginia, within 50 miles of Washington, they strip their own families of provisions, leaving them as our army advances to be fed by us or to starve without our lines." Early in the Atlanta campaign, Ellen gave birth to a son. Now she was planning on moving the family to South Bend, Indiana, to send the older children to school. Sherman didn't like the added expense of having to support the household when they were living with her father in Lancaster, but he was also happy that Ellen was getting away from her father. After Atlanta's capture, Sherman and his army relaxed. 3 prominent Confederates, former U.S. congressmen, came to Sherman under a flag of truce. Sherman urged them to talk to the governor and have him pull Georgia out of the war. If they did that, Sherman insisted there would be no further devastation of the state. Despite his urging, the Georgians refused to pull Georgia out of the war. As Grant battered Robert E. Lee in the entrenchments around Richmond and Petersburg, Grant sent a staff member to Sherman to discuss the next phase of the war. When the staff member reached Sherman's headquarters, a private home near Courthouse Square, he found the conqueror of Atlanta sitting on the porch reading a newspaper, his chair tilted back on its rear legs. Sherman was wearing an unbuttoned coat, a black felt hat pulled down over his forehead, nondescript trousers, and a pair of worn-out slippers. The two men talked at length. Sherman would say, "I am more than ever of the opinion that there ought to be some definite objective point or points decided upon before I move farther into this country. Sweeping around generally through Georgia for the purpose of inflicting damage would not be good generalship. I want to strike out for the sea." Sherman sent the staff member back to Grant with a letter reading, "If you can whip Lee and I can march to the Atlantic, I think Uncle Abe will give us a 20 days leave of absence to see the young folks." On September 21, 1864, Hood and the Army of Tennessee moved from Lovejoy Station to Palmetto Station, 25 miles southeast of Atlanta. There, President Jefferson Davis addressed the troops, blaming Joseph E. Johnston for the defeats in Georgia, and informed them that Nathan Bedford Forrest was wreaking havoc in Tennessee, destroying railroads, and that at the same time that would be done in northern Georgia. Sherman's army would have to starve or retreat. Sherman, upon hearing of the Confederate president's speech, reinforced the garrisons along his railroads and began preparations to go after Hood. On October 3rd, he left Atlanta to combat Hood north of his position, for the Confederate army was attempting to strike at his supply line.